It's the 5 demandments of N64 Mania, brother, and what you gonna do when N64 Mania runs wild on you? Here's 5 reasons. Finally, the Roger has come back to 5 reasons. And hey, the Roger says that it's high time we did a WrestleMania special of this show. I mean, the N64 has a ton of great grapplers, and wrestling games are typically licensed to fairs, so that more often than not means they don't get re-releases, so it's a perfect fit for this show. Now, we've said in the past that we think that maybe the N64 has more great arcade-style racing games than any other home console in history, and, well, I think you can make that argument for wrestling games too. Most of the games on this episode come courtesy of one developer, AKI. Started by former Human Entertainment employees, it's easy to see the pedigree here, since Human was the studio behind the legendary Fire Pro Wrestling series. AKI is still around, now under the name Sin Sophia, and they're responsible for almost 20 wrestling titles, including their most recent for the Japanese mobile market in 2014 called The Golden Hour. They're probably best known by non-wrestling fans in this day and age for the Style Savvy series, but they also developed 2 Japan-only spin-off games in Sega's Yakuza series for the PSP. But the grappling fans, they'll always be AKI, purveyors of the finest 3D wrestling games in history, if not the finest wrestling games in history, period. Oh, and this list doesn't include No Mercy, since I covered it in our last episode of 5 Reasons to Own an N64. So know your role, shut your mouth, and here's 5 wrestling reasons to own a Nintendo 64. WCW vs. NWO World Tour was basically AKI's second game ever. Their first was Virtual Pro Wrestling for the PlayStation 1, which was then brought to the US as WCW vs. the World. This game came out in Japan as Virtual Pro Wrestling 64 before making its way to the West as WCW vs. NWO World Tour, but really they're practically identical games. Even many members of the Japanese roster make it into this version with some changes so as not to infringe on any copyrights or anything, but it's not hard to see Dick Togo, Abdullah the Butcher, and even Taka Michinoku in this game if you're trying. This game bucked the trend in wrestling games, particularly Western-developed ones, in a big way. At that time, button mashing to win grapples was still the way things were often done, but coming from the house that Fire Pro built, AKI's developers weren't having any of that. This game uses a weak, strong attack system with grapples and strikes, and counters for grapples and strikes that are separate buttons. The strong grapples and strikes take a longer time to wind up and are therefore easier to counter, but when they're pulled off it's extremely satisfying and highly damaging. This game makes the mechanics easy for players of all levels to understand, but allows strategy for high-level players. This game was an accessible fighting game on the N64 even before Smash Bros., and that is the lasting appeal of AKI's games. The WCW roster of the day is represented fairly given the time period this game came out. It's not as populous as later games, but it has most of 1997's big stars in WCW, including Hall and Nash, Hogan, Flair, Savage, and more. Speaking of Savage, this game features a handful of hidden wrestlers who can be unlocked by winning titles. Sadly, this is just done by winning a series of matches with no pageantry or storylines or angles or any of the stuff that we expect from wrestling games nowadays. And on that note, the game is actually pretty bare bones overall. I mean, the character models are basic, and by basic I actually mean pretty bad. Take a look at Ric Flair, he looks more like Dino Bravo than Ric Flair. The music is also bad. None of it is actual wrestler TV show themes or anything like that, and the arenas are Spartan, to say the very least. Still, the game was a revelation at the time, based more or less on gameplay alone. The game would become an obsession for many wrestling fans as the N64 entered its second year in the US market, and it would face a huge improvement in the form of WCW NWO Revenge burst onto the scene 366 days after World Tour. THQ and AKI used that year to really give the game a facelift. The character models look so much better, and there are now several arenas from various WCW events, including Monday Nitro, Starrcade, and my personal favorite, Halloween Havoc, complete with Spooky Dude. You get a good look at these sets during the newly added wrestler entrances, and there's even a bit of actual WCW music here in the form of the Nitro theme. The roster is vastly expanded to include both NWO Hollywood and NWO Wolfpack, as well as Raven's Flock and a handful of random made-up wrestlers, like the infamous AKI Man. And unlocking the hidden wrestlers once again means playing through some no-frills title modes, but at least this time there are actual WCW title belts represented. This game also added a ton of new moves, new situations in which you can do your finisher, the ability to steal your opponent's finisher, and new taunts. It's really the platonic ideal of a sequel, you know? More of everything in a slicker package. And if you're a big fan of 90s WCW, then this one still comes highly recommended. Alright, let's take a break for a minute for a non-AKI game. The only non-AKI game on our list, in fact. Did you know that US made N64 games? It's true. The SmackDown games stayed on the PS1 in that era, but in Japan, US developed two N64 grapplers for New Japan Pro Wrestling and Hudson Soft. This is the first one, Toukon Road Brave Spirits. The truth is that it has a pretty limited roster and a wonky control scheme that's similar to the early SmackDown games, but more complicated and not for the better. The roster is cool if you're into 90s Japan stuff, featuring Masahiro Chono, Riki Choshu, Satoshi Kojima, Keiji Muto, and more, but when all's said and done, it's just not a very fun game. Sad but true, the game is basically like a worse version of SmackDown 1 for the original PlayStation, which, yeah, makes it a bit of a hard sell, but if you're a big mark for late 90s New Japan or for the Nintendo 64 itself, in that case, I would recommend it. Acclaim held the WWF license for a good long time, about 10 years in fact, releasing their first WWF game in 1988 for the NES and their final one on the N64, Dreamcast, PS1, and Game Boy Color in 1999. But once that relationship was over, THQ, who had previously held the WCW license, jumped on the WWF. WCW's license went to EA, and Acclaim was left to pick up the ECW license. Now all that moving around turned out to be best for WWF fans who wanted a wrestling game as good as WCW NWO Revenge, because they got WWF WrestleMania 2000. WrestleMania 2000 added something more akin to an actual season mode with the Road to WrestleMania. This mode uses WWF TV shows of the day to move the player along, but doesn't have actual storylines or angles like WWF No Mercy. It also adds cage matches for the first time in an AKI game, as well as Create a Wrestler mode, a longtime staple at a Fire Pro series before this. And once again, this game presents an even bigger roster, and once again it expands the moveset, adding both a seated and sort of halfway downstate wrestlers can be in, which creates new move opportunities for the opponents. You know, the biggest problem with this one is really that it's outdid in every facet by WWF No Mercy. And say what you will about WCW NWO Revenge, at least that game has the potential hook of WCW nostalgia for a modern player. But this one, unless you're really nostalgic for very specific roster features like Chaz, or I don't know, like Gangrel maybe, then this one doesn't really have anything for you and you should just go straight for No Mercy. At the time though, it outdid all of its predecessors handily. Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 Odo Keisho, roughly translated as Succession to the Royal Road, is an officially licensed All Japan Pro Wrestling game. But that didn't stop AKI from cramming in a ton of other off-brand versions of famous wrestlers from all over the world. This game is like an improved version of WrestleMania 2000, and while it came before No Mercy, it's still held up by some folks, including the phenomenal AJ Styles, as the greatest wrestling game of all time. VPW2 has an utterly massive roster and the most robust creator wrestler seen in possibly any game outside the Fire Pro series. It's the only one of AKI's games to include a logic setting for your created wrestler, so that even when you let the CPU play as them, they behave the way you think they ought to. The full movesets from Revenge and WrestleMania 2000 are locked away here, and there's even a full MMA simulation mode, though I never really played with it. This game uses a handful of real arenas, the only game we're talking about today to do so. Arenas like Korakuen Hall and the Tokyo Dome, as well as actual voiced introduction to the wrestlers to lend a sense of authenticity. No mean feat on the N64, let me tell you. It adds another new move situation as well with the running grapple. And it has something no other game that I can think of has, a second level of the special meter. All the games we've talked about so far have the spirit or attitude bar, and when it's full you can use your finisher. But VPW2 takes it one step further, and if you can get your bar up another level, you can use extra special moves, referred to by fans as the Burning Special. This is the kind of maneuver that puts a definite end to matches, the kind of move exemplified by Kenta Kobashi's Burning Hammer. Honestly, for me, VPW is a second place to No Mercy, but that's only because of the latter's more robust story mode. This is a great game and absolutely a worthy addition to any wrestling fan software library. The only problem is that, of course, it's expensive. It's the most expensive game on this list, as you've heard me say so many times in previous episodes. This one is $40 to $60 for a bare cart, which I guess isn't terrible in today's retro gaming aftermarket, but come on, it's a wrestling game. Those are reliably some of the cheapest games to collect. Every other game on this list will cost you $5 or less. Every one. And even No Mercy is only like 15 bucks these days, so yeah, there's a bit of a price tag, but if you really love wrestling games and you've played No Mercy to death, this is absolutely one to add to your collection. And that'll do it. Thanks so much for watching, and stick around because hey, before WrestleMania, Joey Pink is going to be back with a same name, different game wrestling extravaganza. You won't want to miss it if you smell what the Roger is cooking.
WCW NWO Revenge, only on Nintendo 64. Nintendo Power says WCW NWO action is bigger than ever. Fans will eat this one up. Featuring over 60 of WCW and NWO superstars with custom finishes and trademark moves. 4-player Battle Royal mode with double teaming and more weapons than ever before. Get addicted. Call 1-800-WCW-8661 to order now. Also available wherever video games are sold. Revenge is just too sweet.